Well, good morning, everybody. We'll give everybody a minute or so to get their, headphones and all that jazz connected up. Thanks for coming this morning. Hopefully y'all, well, if you didn't get wind, maybe you got some precip out of this moisture this weekend, would be great. I know not everybody did. We did okay on the west slope, so I'm happy about that.
We had wind, period.
Yeah, that's what I've heard from a bunch of people, unfortunately.
Our house recorded a 57.1 gust.
Ouch. Everything make it through all right, Regan?
I have a bunch of things thrown all like my tarps that I had nicely folded up on a gas tank rack. They're all over the field.
Oh, no. Well,
Some wood that I had drying, some little shingles that I had drying so I could use them. They got blown away. Just stuff like that. If it's not tied down, it went away.
yeah, well, hopefully everybody made it through without too much damage and a little pickup, no big deal, right?
Dry, better than Texas.
Right, yeah. I have a friend up in Montana said the wind was pretty nasty this weekend too, so. All right, well, let's go ahead and get rolling. We got a lot of really great information to share today. We're not going to spend much time on anything other than introducing our guest speakers. So first of all, Retta Bruegger with CSU Extension. She's the range management specialist on the Western Slope, is going to help us out for a little bit here to start off the session. And then Amy Overn, also with CSU Extension's range management specialist program. She's the Eastern Colorado and San Luis Valley specialist there. So we're going to talk a little bit about soil health and rangeland and dryland and talk about some specific practices, show some examples. So Retta's going to kind of dive in to start us off, and then we'll turn it over to Annie. We'll have time for questions. And we're going to get a little poll kicked off here shortly too. So thank you so much, Retta. Go ahead.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks, John, for having us today. And I see a lot of familiar names on the call, so it's nice to see you all today. I think a lot of you I've been on webinars with me before, and I talk about drought a lot. So I'll be repeating that today, but I'll also be diving deeper into my specialty, which is range management. So excited to talk about that today. As John mentioned, I'm based in Grand Junction. I serve the western part of Colorado in my capacity as a range management specialist with CSU. And today we're going to be really focusing in on rangelands and drylands as particular types of land that demand unique consideration when we think about soil health. So hopefully today you leave with sort of an outline on the theories and ideas that can help guide you towards management that you would opt in and choose to do. We're not giving you a cookbook or a template for what you should be doing or should not be doing, but we're giving you that basic framework that outlines the ideas, the theories that might help guide what could be a viable practice or a non-viable practice in your area. So that's what we'll cover today. And then, when we had this conversation to prepare for this webinar, it was like, oh, all of that will be really great to share. And then I was like, wait a minute, that's 4 presentations. So just be aware that it's a little bit abbreviated, but I'm, around if anyone wanted help or most of you know where to find me, but I'll share my contact information if you want to dive deeper. So to start out with, I wanted to share just some questions to learn more about who's here, and I do recognize many of you. But yeah, so John, did you mind launching the poll? I wanted to know, what capacity you're involved in the soil health program and what questions you have or are you getting on soil health in rangelands. So yeah, let's go ahead and
Rita's going to
launch
help launch that poll for us.
Yeah, mine now says I don't have access. Lisa, I think it might be on your account now.
All right, well, that's okay. So is it a no-go or?
We'll find it.
Okay.
I think when we came on, it switched around our host, so apologize for the delay for just a second there.
That's okay. I mean, I've had this before. While we're waiting, oh, there we go. Cool, it has come up.
Excellent.
So what questions do you have or are you getting on soil health in rangelands? Oh, and I haven't answered it. All right. Are the answers coming in, John and whoever is running the poll?
Yes, a couple of people are sending in answers.
Cool.
And Retta, I think one of the reasons we wanted to know this, just kind of making sure we understand who's here today, and then gives us an opportunity to kind of dial in our discussion a little bit. So why don't we
Sure.
go ahead and share those results, Lisa?
Cool. Well,
Apparently having some troubles with it
we're
today.
having
Sorry
some
about
troubles.
that.
All right. Well, so let's make something up. I mean, I can see from the names on the call that I know many of you are helping to administer the program. You work at conservation districts, etc. I also see some producers on the call. So it looks like there's kind of a mix of people involved, some technical advisors. It looks like we have one question. It's actually the question what I submitted. I get a lot of questions on grazing management in rangelands, and I also get a lot of questions on, I think, the challenge of transferring practices or ideas that were developed for tilled agriculture into rangeland systems. So it looks like most people did not write in response to the question, but that's what I'll be touching on today. So I'll touch on, as we go through my presentation, some of the key things to know about rangelands when we're managing rangelands in particular, and then I'll talk about some ideas for practices.
Yeah, Retta, what we'll have people do is just go ahead, and if they do have questions, just go ahead and put that in the chat, and we'll keep an eye on the chat for you all, so we can track it there. Sorry about that, and thank you for your patience.
Yeah, no worries. All right, well, so let's dive in. So first, I thought I would just reframe this conversation. You know, since you're on the call, I presume that you care about soil health, but I wanted to highlight some aspects of soil health that I do think are really important. Some people are interested in soil health just because they like soil and it's connected to their aspirations for sustainability and other things. But when we're talking about agriculture, soil health can be connected to profitability. So on rangelands, we did some studies in northwestern Colorado when I first started with CSU, where we identified sites across the landscape that shared similar soil and climate characteristics, but they had actually different plant communities. And some plant communities were associated with past management, and those plant communities were far less productive. We quantified how much less productive they were compared to non-degraded plant communities, and it was about 300 pounds per acre less production on degraded plant communities. And that maybe doesn't sound like a lot, especially in types of agriculture where you're producing several tons to the acre in terms of your production, but on rangelands that can be significant. And especially we think about the scales at which livestock production occurs in Colorado. If you multiply 330 pounds times even 100 acres, you're missing out potentially on 3,300 pounds of production due to degradation. So on rangelands, we may care about soil health because we like soil or care about soil health, but we also might care because losing production due to degradation is expensive in the long run. So there is a tie to profitability over the long term. We also know, and I'll talk more about this, but that it's much cheaper to avoid degradation than it is to restore a site. So we'll talk more about what that looks like. But soil health, basically, some people just like soil. Some people, I think there is that tie to profitability. That's important to think about. Final point here is that many producers I work with just get a lot of gratification from being a steward of landscapes they manage. So that might be another motivation for folks. So let's dive a little bit into what rangelands are in particular and how they're unique ecosystems. So rangelands, I put up here this definition paraphrased from the Society for Range Management. I think rangelands are something that like many of us intuitively would be able to identify. They look like what I show in this picture here, but we might struggle to put that into words. So the definition is something along the lines of a type of non-forested land dominated by usually native perennial plants, such as grasses, forbs, and shrubs, that is managed as a natural ecosystem. So I think the really key thing for soil health here is this bit down below, managed as a natural ecosystem. We're not using the same types of practices that we're using in tilled agriculture because we're dealing with many forces that are beyond our control. So I wanted to highlight this other definition from Jeff Herrick, who actually helped design the initial STAR program. He's a soil scientist with the Jornada Experimental Range out of New Mexico. And him and Joel Brown wrote this in a paper that they published. Similar aspects, but they write, rangelands are largely extensively managed as naturalized systems with minimal cultural inputs, largely relying on the manager's ability to recognize impending changes, desirable or not, and adjust actions to avoid or take advantage of conditions beyond their control. So I think the key things to highlight here, this is probably true in all of agriculture, that agriculture is always responding to things that are beyond the control of the producers. But in rangelands in particular, the key piece of control that we do have is that ability to recognize when things are changing and adjust accordingly. And we'll talk more about that. But our tools in rangeland management, they're not as linear. We can't do X and be sure to get Y because there's so many other forces beyond our control. So we need a different approach compared to what we might use in another agricultural system where we have more control in terms of irrigation or fertilizer management or other things like that. So moving further into, what are some of the key differences between rangelands and other types of ecosystems, and what does that mean for soil health? I wanted to revisit the soil health principles. So these are the 5 principles here, paraphrased by me: keep the soil covered, minimize disturbance, live roots, diversity, and livestock integration. And again, if you think about rangelands, and that's this picture here, huge component of the total land in the state is rangeland. Many of these things are already happening, and these things are already inherent to what rangelands are, right? Rangelands, if you look at this picture, we generally have cover. We're not tilling rangelands. That's hugely destructive to rangelands. But in Colorado, many of the plants, or if it's a non-degraded rangelands, it is a perennial system, not an annual system. So we do have live roots. We have lots of diversity. Rangelands, the production tends to be low, but the diversity is really high, especially compared to other types of agriculture. And these lands are grazed and have been grazed for a really long time. So we already have livestock integration. So when we look at these principles, I think it's pretty clear that they were developed for other types of agriculture where we're doing things like tilling the land, where we're applying fertilizer, where we're irrigating. So the question is, how do they actually apply to a context where inherent to what these lands are, we're not doing those things, and those things have limited power to accomplish what we want? So that's a framework I think that's important for us to recognize when we're thinking about rangelands. These are different systems, and our place in them is different. We have less control. And instead, our control comes from our ability to understand how these ecosystems functions and respond to that. All right. So I bring that up because I'm a range management specialist, and I have to, because I like it. I like range management, and I think it's really important. And these are, a very extensive ecosystem or landscape type in Colorado, but I think they're pretty poorly understood. So that's my pitch for range science. You have to understand some of those inherent dynamics when we're thinking about how do we make these lands healthier or better from a soil health perspective. So now I'm going to jump into some of the things I think we can do, and then Annie's going to talk more about some other stuff. So the things I'll jump into really quick are strategic decisions I think that we can make as managers. I'll talk a little bit about drought management, and then I'll highlight some tools for monitoring. And then grazing management's a big component of that, but Annie's going to dive more into the grazing management component. So I wanted to highlight that degraded lands are the biggest potential gain for soil health in rangelands. So we know that from several lines of research. It's lands that are degraded where we can have the biggest gain in terms of carbon and in terms of soil health. But there's 2 challenges with this that I really want to drive home. One is it's not as easy as you would think to define what degraded is. So for example, if we look at this photo, we could ask ourselves, is this degraded, and can this be improved by management? I think that's actually really hard to tell from just this photo alone. Sure, there's not that many perennial bunch grasses that I see in this photo, but that might be part of the potential of the site. I know where this photo was taken. It's a really dry area, and shrubs tend to do better because of how arid this is. So anyway, it could be degraded. It could also be a reflection of the inherent potential. So whenever we're talking about implementing a practice on rangeland, we really want to understand what is the soil and site potential so that we can make strategic choices. There's a lot more we could say there, but if you have questions or if this is a question in your management, happy to talk more about it. Now, let's say you have an area that is clearly degraded. I'm working, for example, or consulting a bit on a ranch that has some degraded land for the soil health program. And there it is really clear that it's degraded. It's not a potential issue. It is degraded. You know, similarly in this pasture here, if this was rangeland, I would look at this and we see only annual species, only annual invasive species. So I think we have a pretty clear indication that this is degraded. If you're thinking about managing degraded lands though, or having some kind of management intervention for the soil health program to improve those lands, I think you really need to consider why is that land degraded and has that disturbance stopped? So for example, I think this happens a lot where if the reason land is degraded is because of grazing practices or overuse by livestock, and that has not stopped, like the management is continuing, then anything you do to try to amend that situation through seeding efforts or whatever is not going to be very effective because you haven't addressed the main driver of that particular issue. So I'd really encourage us to think you need to remove that disturbance before you implement something to solve it. It's sort of like if the faucet's on and overflowing onto the floor, the solution to that problem is not mopping up the floor. The solution is turning off the faucet. So we really need to be, or fixing the leaky pipe or whatever. So we really need to be thinking about that when we're thinking about degraded lands. Why is it degraded and has that disturbance stopped? Second thing to think about here, especially in my neck of the woods in the western slope, and especially in environments that are receiving around 13 inches of precipitation or less a year, we know that seeding has a very low rate of success. I think it's about 90% failure for dryland seedings in that precipitation zone. So that's a huge amount of failure. Not to say it's always a bad idea, but it is to say we need to be really cognizant of when, if the strategy is to apply seed, we need to be really cognizant of the context that we're doing that. So again, the context that I'm working in as part of the soil health program, I think seeding would have a very low chance of success. We really need to be doing other management practices before we seed in order to give seeding any chance of success there because of the state the land's in. So I think really consider your context and consider the tools that you have. Seeding is a really popular choice. We get asked all the time in Extension about like, what should I seed with and stuff like that, but it might not always be the first thing you need to go to. You might need to be looking at other things like soil stabilization or whatever before you're looking to seed.
Hey, Retta, that's a really good point. And we had a bunch of questions. We were able to capture the questions from the poll about cover crops or seeding or broadcasting or drilling. And you might be getting into this, but I think you made a really good overall statement. And I'd like to also say it depends big time. So they're very specific recommendations as well. But yeah, I don't know if you're covering that or we can go back to it later too.
Yeah, let's pause and just talk about it. And I can't see those questions, but and then Annie, if you wanted to weigh in here too, I do get asked like cover crops on rangelands. Is that a question? So that's something that honestly I find a little bit confusing. I think again, it's one of those like lost in translations of like coming from tilled agriculture to rangeland context. Because, well, so if it's an irrigated pasture, then I could see cover crops. If we're talking about rangeland, like this type of environment that I'm showing the picture here, this isn't an appropriate context for cover crop. We already have high diversity from the native plants that are here. And it's going to actually be really challenging to seed into this environment because this picture was taken in a drought, but there's high cover. And so anyway, so in this context, I think cover cropping is not appropriate. If we're talking about an irrigated pasture, cover cropping might be appropriate. So that's one of the distinctions I would make there.
Yeah,
So
and
Annie, go for it.
I'll
Yeah.
weigh in a little bit here. A lot of times, most of the time, if you're running a tractor and a drill rig through rangelands, you're doing more damage because you're probably not going to get a response. I will talk about a context in which I think that cover cropping is appropriate, and we'll see that later on. Not cover cropping in like a really classic sense, like where the entire thing is going to be a cover crop. But I tend to, any kind of soil disturbance is going to be worse than leaving it alone. You know, a tractor and a drill rig are really, really heavy, and you're going to disturb a lot of soil.
Awesome. I think one thing too is that on rangelands, there's a lot of diversity across the landscape. It's not always about is there diversity where I'm looking down at that one little point? There's diversity across the landscape that's driven by soil differences as you move across the landscape. And Annie, I think, well, you're working on an experiment where they've really dialed or drilled down into the important role of, we call it heterogeneity across the landscape for rangeland birds. And I've worked on a study too in northwestern Colorado where that was really highlighted. So if the goal is to increase diversity, then I think we need to be thinking about that in a rangeland context. So, okay. Well, I've exceeded my 20 minutes. So what should I do? Should I go quickly through the rest of my slides, or should we pause and take some more questions? What was that?
Sorry, we've got a little extra time, so go for it.
Okay, but keep jumping in with questions, John, because that will help me make it more relevant. So, okay, drought management. So I think, let's say you're working with rangelands that are not degraded. Like you do some background contextualization, they're not degraded. Or even if they are degraded, drought management is still important. And there's many reasons why drought management is essential on rangelands. We can't go into all of them. So I think the really big thing that I want to leave you with here is the importance of matching supply and demand. So that really comes down to the reality that on rangelands, we get variable amounts of production year to year. It's not a constant. And what that means, and this is really hard, but what that means is that we need to be moderating the demand for forage by grazing livestock accordingly. So this is from the Central Plains Experimental Range, where Annie has done a lot of work. It's managed by the USDA ARS and was founded in the 1930s in response to the Dust Bowl. But basically, they have a lot of data. So what we're looking at here is pictures of the same pasture, same management, managed, I think, for moderate grazing for the past 70 years. And what you can see here is variation in the amount of production that's due to weather alone. So 2002, really famous drought year, really catalyzed a lot of drought action in the state of Colorado. And that year they had about 200 pounds of production. So that's very low production. 2003, apparently it rained at the right time, and that increased sixfold to 1,300 pounds per acre. Back down in 2004 to 700, and back up in 2005 to 1,200. So this is a pretty extreme example. The West Slope is not this variable. We're a little more constant. But the point is that we have varying amounts of supply each year in terms of forage on rangeland. And that matters because if we have the same stocking rate every single year, we're overutilizing in some years and we're underutilizing in other years. So for drought management, one thing we talk a lot about is making sure you're flexing your demand for forage relative to the supply. So how can you do that? It's actually a lot harder than it looks, but Annie and I have both been working with a plan called the Drought Plan Program to help people make drought plans. I'll talk more about that in a second, but it does come down to making a drought plan, which is basically a strategic management plan of setting goals, developing strategies, and then making decision points. Again, this could be one whole presentation, but we have a range of resources to help with this at droughtadvisors.org, which is our website. And I'd want to really highlight, we have a whole bunch of webinars on how to make a drought plan, aspects of drought planning. We also have a drought handbook, which details how do you make a drought plan and then aspects of setting a stocking rate. How do you flex a stocking rate? So I encourage you to check this out. And then I think what I'll do here, John, should I stop here? And if we have time, we'll talk about tools for monitoring. So yeah, I'm gonna stop here and we can talk more about tools for monitoring if we have time at the end.
And I think all this stuff is great, and we could consider an additional session potentially down the road to kind of look more at these, how do we monitor aspects? And then we'll also be sharing some resources that Retta and Annie have been working on in other aspects. So thank you so much, Retta.
How easy would it be to just share the stocking rate calculator?
Oh, to show that app really quick?
Yeah, because I think that that's really great.
Okay. Well, I can do that. I have that ready to go. John, is that okay with you?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. Am I showing the right screen?
Not right now.
Now I am, right? Nope.
You're gonna have to share again, I think. Sorry.
Okay. No worries. Okay. Share it again. Now it's right.
There you go.
Okay, so the tools Annie mentioned a couple years ago, we made a stocking rate carrying capacity calculator. So this is getting at that question of like, we have fluctuating amounts of forage on rangeland. Also on the western slope, we have really bad data about how much forage is actually out there on rangelands. So a couple years ago, I worked with a student at the time who is smarter than I am, and he was able to create this app. It's on our website, rangemanagement.extension.colostate.edu. Stocking rate, but you can just get to it from the homepage. I'll put this link in the chat. Basically, what you can do is you can draw a pasture or you can import a KML, and you can choose the data set that you wish to use. So we're bringing in data from the Rangelands analysis platform, which I could show in, if we have time, I'll show that as well. But it was data that basically trained satellite imagery using 15,000 hand-collected plots that were collected by the BLM and the NRCS. And so they're able to go back in time and look at forage production since 1986. So you can use this and set your consumption rate, percent edible. We have these question marks here if you have questions on any aspect of it. So basically, though, you can draw it and it will give you a sense of your acreages, your days, and the head that area can support. And you can also choose low production years, average, quote, or high production years. We also have in the app, in real time, it loads your precipitation for the year. So you can have this line is the average precipitation by month that you receive. And then the bars show what you're getting that year relates to the average. And we also have a drought tab, which brings up the Palmer Drought Severity Index for that area. And you can edit your forage estimate. So that's all available on our app, the Rangeland analysis platform at rangelands.app. Again, we use their data and their tool does pretty much the same thing, but they have some cool features where you can look at growth in real time. So I'm getting those here. So as we get into the springtime, this will load in real time. And you can compare how your growth rate this year compares to past years. So both these tools, yeah, I'll stop there, but they use the same data. And I think they're pretty great tools for folks to answer those questions about how your supply fluctuates over time. And I'll say one more thing about these tools and then I'll stop. But the developers of the Rangelands analysis platform would never say that you should rely on the data and not your own experience. They are very adamant that these are a tool in the toolbox and you need to be filtering them through your own experience. But that's how I view them. They're a tool in the toolbox. I do think they're a really good tool in the toolbox because we lack so much data for much of Colorado. So encourage you to use them. If they're hard to use, you're welcome to contact me and I'm happy to walk you through it.
Great. Thank you, Retta. I think that calculator is really, really useful if you're trying to figure out your stock rate. And that is just absolutely crucial for managing range. Okay. All right. Okay, can everyone see that? Yeah,
You
okay,
got it.
thank you. I'm Annie. Basically, I have Retta's job on the eastern slope. So I cover the plains and the San Luis Valley. So the one thing that I really want to drive home in this first slide is that in order to manage rangelands, we have to really immerse ourselves in it in order to really understand it. And I'll give you a good example of this. It's really, really easy for me. I'm also a rancher. It's really easy for me to come at thinking about soil health and be really idealistic about it. And then when I go and, ride across a pasture that's 1,000 acres or 2,000 acres, then it kind of really brings me down to reality. And so that's why I say it's really important to immerse yourself in these landscapes to truly understand scale and how to manage them. Retta brought up a great point, and that is our rangelands are their native systems, their natural systems, and they're really, really beautiful, and they're incredibly complex. And the soil biology is incredibly complex as well. And we're learning a lot about that. So once you recognize that you are part of the landscape and you're a part manager of this landscape, it really changes the way you manage the landscape and see the landscape. All of these guys here, some gals, they're all ranchers. They're all learning about how they are managing their soils for the idea that soils are alive. This is a really different paradigm shift. Like the concept of soils being alive is very new to us. And so that's really a lot of the work that we're doing, is to understand the role of living microbes in the soil. Retta did a great job of contextualizing the 5 soil health principles, but I would add the 6th, and that is that the soil is alive and we need to manage for it. So how are rangelands different in terms of soil than farm fields? Well, first of all, the plant is getting its nutrients from the soil microbes. That's very, very important. We're not putting stuff on there. In order for this system to work, that plant needs to mine those nutrients from the system of CO2 coming into the plant, feeding the microbial community, getting nutrients to then give back to the plant. And then there's also the cycle of the plant dying, so we get litter. But then we also get litter, organic matter, in the form of the necromass, which is the dead microbial community. And what we're seeing, so there are basically 2 pathways. So there's this litter pathway, and then there's this necromass pathway. So the cycle of organic matter formation, it really relies on that plant being alive, getting in CO2, feeding the microbes, getting nutrients, and on and on and on. It's a cycle, and there are a few things that are really, really important for the cycle to work, and that is the aggregate. So we need to have this aggregate where those processes are happening, where the nitrogen cycle is happening, for example. This air component is very, very important also for water infiltration. And that's really important on rangelands, and recognizing where your limitations are on rangelands in terms of porosity and aggregation is an important part of understanding your potential. So this is just some research that Steve Bruegger, in Southeast Colorado. And what we see here is that there's a direct relationship between organic matter and microbial biomass. So that again drives the point that a lot of our organic matter is actually from that necromass, not just litter. So the way that we think about grazing in the past, we've always thought about grazing for just litter on the surface. Well, we need to think about the necromass contained within the soil profile as well. And then there's a direct correlation between your soil health score, at least on these plains on the eastern Colorado, and our microbial biomass. This is pretty interesting information. So how do we support organic formation? Really by understanding how rangelands change with management. So Retta talked a lot about these rangelands on the western slope. I'm going to focus on these rangelands on the eastern slope, but we can definitely answer any questions depending on your context. And then also this model is going to kind of relate to the San Luis Valley, and then North Park, and then Middle Park, or I guess that's South Park. Trying to, oh, here we go. Okay, so this is what's called the state in transition model. And this is for the Blue Grama rangelands. So basically it's the eastern plains. So what we have here, let me move this, I have way too many Zoom things going on here. I want to look at the rangelands that we can alter with grazing. And then we're going to separate that from the rangelands that are basically too degraded to just deal with grazing management. So first of all, we're going to start here in the middle. This is called the reference community. And this reference community has an fairly even distribution of blue grama, western wheat, and shrubs. Now, what happens is if we go up in this box here, if we graze this rangeland at the wrong time, if we graze it heavily in the spring, we graze out our cool season grasses. And that really affects our soil profile because our cool seasons on the Western Plains, a lot of times they have really good root systems, and we're also grazing out our forage component. And that forage component is really important because not only do livestock really depend on that forage component, but forbs have a different kind of root system and they're getting nutrients from different parts in the profile. And so if you take that forb away, then you're not mobilizing certain minerals that are essential for photosynthesis, like phosphorus, for example. We go down in this box here, the decadent community, excessive litter. That's the community that hasn't been grazed, needs to be grazed on the Eastern Plains. That's where you're getting, I mean, I hear it all the time, like CRP grass, which is a grass that's it's not very palatable, but it tends to accumulate, has a lot of litter when it's not grazed. And so what we can do in this situation is graze it. Now, the important thing to think about in a system like this is nutrition. We go to this sod-bound blue grama state here. This is the focus of a lot of my research right now, is how do we get the sod-bound blue grama state back into the reference state. It has very, very little diversity, very little organic matter. What we are experimenting with this now is putting seeds through a cow and grazing to get the diversity back in there. So they're actually distributing seeds out on the landscape to get those seeds back in. And then we're going to talk about this eroded state. On the Eastern Plains, San Luis Valley, a lot of places, this eroded state is there because it was once farmed. And so now it's just weeds and bare ground, and it takes a very long time to come back. For some reason, I am not. Hang on a minute here. Not going forward for me here. There we go. So the deficits of biodiversity and productivity needs lingers. How long does the state last on the Eastern Plains? And I've seen this all over the West. 91 years after agricultural abandonment. So when we change rangeland into, when we harvest, when we turn it into a cropland, it takes forever for it to come back. So one of the things I really want to drive home now is that's one of the worst things that we can do for rangelands is convert it. And that means converting it to houses too. Obviously, that's fairly permanent. So, let's see. I want to go back here. One of the things that the state transition presents is how land changes with management, but it also represents soil structure and therefore your soil health. So here in this reference community, you're going to have a lot better soil health than you're going to have over here. And there is also what we're finding, a biological microbial succession. So not only are we thinking about changing the plant species on the surface, we're thinking about incorporating the concept that we have of soil biological succession. So for example, in this eroded state down here, we have a ton of bacteria and not much fungi. We also have a lot of our higher organisms like protists, they are missing from that system. Whereas here, they would be in this system. So I'm going to talk about, so here's just some pictures. These are, if you can see this, I look at aerial imagery a lot. In this aerial imagery on the top here, you can see these are old pivots. And in these old pivots, this is what it looks like up here in the right-hand corner. We have lots of photosynthesis and organic matter. In this area between the swales, this is what this looks like. So this is sod-bound blue grama. And so we're going to manage these swales, and we're going to manage the sod-bound blue grama really differently. We'll also manage these old fallow fields a lot differently. And we're going to study them differently. We're not going to study them differently, but we're going to do tests and we're going to get information about each individual unit. So if I'm doing soil testing, I'm going to take a test in this swale. I'm going to take it up in this sod, and I'm also going to take it up in this pivot. So we start by learning about our soils. One of the tests I really like to do is breathe water infiltration. I'm not going to go, what's my time looking like? This is basically you're pounding it over the ground, pouring water in it, and you're seeing how long does it take for the water to infiltrate in? The flake test. This is one of my favorite tests because this test tells you about your aggregation. This sample here, you basically just take a shovel, aggregate, put it in some water, and you see how much that sample is falling apart. If you have good aggregation, like up here on the right, you'll see that aggregate is sticking together. You're going to get really good water and air infiltration into that aggregate. Assessing soil compaction, super important because you can have a limiting factor in your soil profile because of compaction. So you want to know, especially in those old farm fields, you want to know, do you have a compacted layer? And then this is just a really good YouTube. They go over kind of the ins and outs of looking at of assessing soil compaction. And I don't want to just say compaction, I want to say soil tightness. You could have tightness in your soil for many different reasons. And therefore, you wouldn't have great porosity. I always look at the roots. So I'm looking to see if I have a different diversity of roots. These different kinds of roots are going to be getting different minerals, and they're going to be taking up minerals differentially. Different kinds of grasses, they will form different alliances with biology. And so I want to see, do I have these alliances in my soil? Do I have mycorrhizal fungi? Do I have things sticking to the roots? And these are our soil moisture monitors. You guys probably know about those. We did a webinar. I did a webinar with David Hoover where he discusses really the ins and outs of soil moisture. I encourage anyone to watch that. It's on our website. But basically, the important thing to me that this is telling me is when are my grasses and when is my range growing? And how do I manage for that accordingly? If I really want to increase organic matter, I really want to increase biomass. on a certain area that has a certain texture, I know that maybe I don't want to put my cows on this spot right now. So this is the Ward lab test. I'm sure a lot of you will be doing that test or administering that test. The biggest thing that I use this for is whether or not I have essential minerals that are missing from the profile that are essential to photosynthesis. And the other thing is I want to know if I have excesses of minerals. So for example, calcium will tie up magnesium. It will tie up other things, copper. We want to know if we have excesses, is that going to be getting another nutrient? And it's important to know that this test does not tell you if that mineral is plant available. The way that you know if that mineral is plant available is by looking at your forage test or doing a sap analysis test. I talked a little bit about this, but this is really important. If your calcium and magnesium and potassium are not in the correct ratio, then you can get a real tightness of soil. So when you're going and looking, you have your probe or whatever, and you're trying to see if you've got, really, really tight soils, you might have tight soils because you have too much magnesium or too much potassium compared to calcium. One of the things that I notice is that I have a lot of calcium in my soil profile. I'll often get crusting on the surface. That can be remedied actually with hoof action to a certain extent. So that soil test, the soil test is really important for kind of understanding those dynamics. So now that we've collected some information, we can start to manage for improving the soils. This is the plant tissue test that I was talking about. This is the test telling me, are my soils biologically active enough to take these minerals and put them into the plant tissue? So the sap test is also really good because the sap test is telling you what is going into that sap at certain points, during the growing season. This is the other thing that I really look at is that if I'm going to be using livestock to renovate a pasture, like those areas that have a lot of thatch in them, for example, or a pivot, I really, really want to understand what those implications are going to be to the cow, because I don't want my cows to lose weight. Definitely don't want my yearlings to lose weight. So I do a forage test, and part of that forage test is looking at crude protein, TDN, and ADS. So basically, crude protein, you want to be really above 9. It depends on what stage your animal is in. I also look at TDN, so how much energy is there? We want to make sure that there's enough energy. And then ADS is basically indigestible material. So if you are using your cows, for example, to put more organic matter into CRP, I'm working on a project like that right now. A lot of that CRP grass is going to be indigestible. So that means that you need to supplement with protein. You're going to want to supplement probably with the minerals, and you want to know what is missing. So this is just an example of actually one of my irrigated pastures. I put humic acid and a high foam compost on it. And you'll see that the crude protein came up, as did TDN, but that ADS went down. So I am not a huge advocate of your pasture size being too low or too small. And one of the reasons for that is that your animals, they know what they need. And I love the work of Fred Provenza, but basically he says animal preference is it's more than just a taste, but a signal for what they need. If your pasture sizes are too small, they can't get what they need, and they can't self-medicate. And the other really, really important thing about grazing is that grazing management really helps with decomposition, but it's also an inoculation event. So when they're grazing, they're taking some of that biology and they're putting it somewhere else. It's really an incredible system. And so that means that on the Eastern Plains, the bison were a part of this system, we can see our cattle as being a part of that trophic level. That's part of the system of breaking things down and re-inoculating. So we went over the areas that we manage with grazing, stocking rates, super, super important. The other thing that is really important is your graze period. So in terms of introducing diversity into your system, the most important thing to me is making sure that you're not coming back to that piece of ground at the same time of year. So that's pretty huge for increasing your diversity. And then adequate rest. Like, you've got to have enough carbohydrates going back into the system. I think we all know that. So I'm going to look at some examples here. This is a really healthy range. And Retta was talking earlier about diversity. You can see diversity on rangelands is not necessarily homogeneous. Like, it's not like, this acre has 6 different species in it. A lot of times this acre here has blue grama, and then this little 5 by 10 patch has got a lot of western wheat in it. So it's very patchy. Rangelands are very, very patchy. What I want to say about this is that here we have to recognize that this diversity in this particular system is partially driven by our rodent population. So acknowledge that those rodents are really important. What they do for us is they often loosen up that soil. When you get that loosen up of the soil, you will get Russian thistle, for example. Like, don't get nervous about that. Because a lot of times what's coming in after that Russian thistle is western wheat. So we're introducing our biology and our diversity with our rodent population. This picture right here was taken like last Friday, I think. Here we're just seeing the biological activity of beetles on that stuff. Go on, and it's not forwarding. Hang on. Just here we go. That's an example of the Russian thistle pocket. Same thing with prairie dogs. Prairie dogs, I mean, a lot of us don't like prairie dogs because they take out that production. The one thing I will say about prairie dogs is we just did some research on the nutrition of prairie dogs, of old prairie dog colonies. The crude protein and TDN was 3 times higher than the area that hadn't been impacted by prairie dogs. So prairie dogs do have this component of also doing what pocket gophers can do in this natural succession. Okay, so this is our sod-bound blue grama. Not a lot of diversity here. This is the we're really doing quite a lot of research in this realm right here to figure out how to get diversity in here. I'm partnering with BYU and UNR to do a rumen bypass study. And we're looking at different seeds that pass through the rumen quickly. So some of those seeds are, ironically, Retta, blue bunch wheatgrass, is one that goes through the rumen. The other one is Indian rice grass, but you've got to get it to go through the rumen within 2 days. So what does that mean? How do you do that? When we feed protein supplement, for example, their stool is a lot looser and you can get things to go through the rumen faster. I'm not necessarily recommending this for the STAR program, but it is an area where we are doing some research. The other thing that's really important is how thick that pat is. So if your manure is 2 weeks or like 2 inches deep, it's not, that seed is probably not going to come through in the pat. But if it's, kind of runny, it's probably going to come through in that pat a lot more. Okay, so now we are going on to more degraded land. So to that state and transition model where we've got old pivots, we've got CRP. If you look at the picture on the bottom, it looks awesome, doesn't it? Right? It's not. You've got to really get out on the ground and take a look at it. What you will see is that there's a ton of bare ground in amongst these very tall grasses. And this is an example where I definitely did, we did forage analysis here because I wanted to see what those implications were going to be for the rancher if we used livestock to improve the organic matter. So what we see here is in the blue grama, you know, for example, the ADF is relatively low, protein is pretty high, but as we go into that CRP, we'll see that ADF is really very high. And so we know that it's very indigestible. And so we need to manage for that. And then this is, how much time do we have? 1 minute. So the no-till, this is a pivot right here. This is an old pivot. And you'll see that we've got some native species coming in, but we have a lot of bare ground. This is an example where the rancher has some extra oats and he no-till drilled oats into this old pivot. In this circumstance, this works pretty well. One of the reasons why I really like oats and things like sorghum Sudan, triticale, is that they can do really well in drought conditions or in drier conditions. He gets about 14 inches of precip here. And this was last year, so we had a ton of moisture. We had like 20 inches of moisture. It's really a great feeder of fungi. So I like what's going on here. I would probably, at the same time, I would follow that up by feeding the biology. So I might put a humic acid in there as well. So this is a circumstance where it's already hammered. You know, it was a pivot. The biology is not a, you know, it's not a late successional grassland. So this is a great example of how interseeding, this is not cover cropping, but how interseeding an annual could do some good. That's it.
I like that point about interseeding and finding the right things that are potentially going to work together to set the stage for our, you know, longer lived perennial species. So really appreciate you mentioning that. We just have a minute or so here, if everybody's okay to hang out for a minute. One of the questions that came in on the earlier was about the benefits of keeping rabbit brush. And I know, Retta, you work a lot in this area, and Annie, you probably have a bunch of experience here. And I think it goes to our diversity thing, but can you maybe touch on the benefits of rabbit brush kind of in a brief minute here?
Sure. Yeah. So rabbit brush, I mean, I think historically people have loved to get rid of brush. And there's reasons for that, because sometimes there's some ecosystems, especially in the western slope, that can get over-dominated by shrubs and other woody species, which can outcompete the grasses. And that's largely due to historic fire suppression and overgrazing historically. So those two forces converge and you can lead to an overpopulation of brush. But that said, the western part of Colorado, shrubs are really, the reason we have rabbit brush, the reason we have sagebrush is coming out of our natural precipitation cycles. So they're part of those precipitation cycles is why we have shrubby species, basically. So if we contrast when precipitation comes on the western slope, it's very different than where it comes in the Great Plains, and that drives why we see a woody component to all of our rangelands on the western slope. So with that said, rabbit brush can be good. There's certain pollinators that feed on certain rabbit brush populations. I believe it's like silver rabbit brush, but rabbit brush in general is pretty toxic to livestock. So it's not like a preferred species for livestock, but it functions in other ways within the ecosystem. So it has those deeper tap roots, it's accessing deeper soil moisture. And, you know, as Annie shared, it's probably also bringing up specific nutrients from below ground. What I would say about rabbit brush, it seems like the question is kind of pro rabbit brush. I can't tell if it's pro or con, but what I would say is it's really about the balance between your woody species and your herbaceous or grass species. It's not about eradication. And we do see in many of the places I've worked, we see rabbit brush coming in as a first sort of successional species after a fire or a disturbance. It precedes sagebrush recolonization of a site. So I would say, like, going back to those principles that guide rangeland management, sometimes it's not about good or bad, it's about quantities of the components. So how does rabbit brush fit in within your larger management goals? Again, it's going to be toxic to most livestock species, so it's not going to be great for that, but it might have some other benefits like accessing soil moisture at deeper layers. It may be adding to diversity. It might be benefiting a pollinator. It might be shading snow in the springtime so the snow stays on the site a little bit longer. So is that answering the question? Okay.
I think that's a great point, and that diversity is a key piece, right? We can't always fight our rangelands. We have to learn how to kind of live with the system if we manage it properly, and we can do that together. I think that's it. One of the points that was made about, how do we actually implement this on a large scale? Well, that's so specific to the producer, where they're at. I think context is so important in this discussion. And additionally, how can we help you fit this into your operation? So, Annie, you might want to make a quick statement on that, but I think it's really important and something we want to work, one-on-one with y'all on.
So I'm going to go back to this example here of looking at this aerial. I do a lot of work looking at aerial imagery and figuring out where it makes the most sense to work on a rangeland. And it's very, very context specific. So, and that context has a lot to do with the way that you're managing your cattle too. A lot of times we will restore a degraded pasture if it's close to headquarters, if it's their catting pasture, those kinds of things. That makes sense. If you, one of the things that I do a lot of thinking about is my swales, because the swales have the most potential for getting water. And so when I'm looking at the swales, I want to know, am I getting organic matter cycling? Are those grasses breaking down? Are those, is that material breaking down? And if it's not, you could do a foliar application on those swales, ATV or a truck. I have what's called a slurry sprayer on my truck, and it holds 250 gallons. And I'll put a slurry in that with whatever that piece needs, and I'll just drive and spray it. It's got a really big nozzle on it. So if you want to put, compost or whatever inside of it, it's not clogging. That's one tool that I use a lot for treating places like swales, things where we really need to get that organic matter cycle working, or we're getting it sputtering out. I might do something like that, but I mean, using aerial imagery is really, really important. And this is one area where I'm really excited to be working with virtual fencing, because like that one example of the CRP, we're going to be doing virtual fencing there. And we can basically, sort of dictate where we want the cows to go. So we're using cows as a tool for restoring. So, and that's one of the take homes too, is like, where are the areas you can use cattle? Where are the areas where it might make sense to do something additional, like amendments?
It's a great point, and I think, one of the things that we can work with our producers on is thinking about this whole farm approach to managing their ground. It's not just because we have funding that can be implemented on one field doesn't mean that's how you have to do this. We can tie the funding to that field, but if you want to help work on developing a new and innovative management plan that encompasses your whole operation, let this program help you do that as well. And I think that's something we can work on. I did want to also point out, we're working on getting some of the representatives from the virtual fencing companies to present some of the stuff. We also have some researchers out of Oregon and Arizona that may also help us out with that. So stay tuned on that. It's probably going to be a month or two down the line, but we're working on getting some contacts to help us do one of these info sessions. So Any last parting words you guys have before we sign off here for today? After I obviously want to thank you as well. This was awesome.
I think we covered a lot. I mean, we could have given like several days, actually. So we really just scratched the surface, but yeah.
Great. And I think, one of the things, everybody's going to keep an eye out for field days and all. We're working with the districts and extension and others to host these field days and go out and get your hands dirty and be able to ask these questions and see what's going on the ground. And those will be coming out across for everybody here before you know it. So, well, with that, maybe we can visit again here before too long, but really
right.
appreciate everybody.
Regan had a quick question about how nutritious is Western wheatgrass. Do you guys want to just quickly answer?
So that's a very interesting question. Western wheatgrass, it can depend, like a lot. Sometimes the crude protein is around 7 or 8, but I have seen it on those prairie dog colonies all the way up to 21% crude protein. So this is an example with your Western wheat where I would definitely do a forage analysis to see. Good question.
Yeah, and I think it depends is a great answer for that because it really does. It's variable.
Yeah,
It gets
and it matters. It depends on your soil profile. Like it depends on how good your aggregation is. It depends on if those minerals are available for the plant.
Yeah, and it also depends on timing. So, in the springtime, you'll have higher leaf ratio to shoot, and so you'll have much higher protein. So it depends on when you're using it. So I guess, sorry, Reagan, we did not answer your question, but it's not a universal value of how nutritious it is. It depends on when it's being harvested by the animal.
Yeah, and it has a bimodal growth curve. So in the spring, it tends to be more nutritious. In the summer, that nutrition goes down. And if we get rain again in the fall, that nutrition will come back up. Good question.
All right, excellent. Well, we will send a follow-up email. Annie, Retta, really appreciate y'all helping us out with this. I think it was super informative. I learned something, as I always do when I hear from you guys. So we'll share out the webinars that y'all have on your Rangelands Extension webpage. And other resources for this session here shortly via email. And remember, everybody, well, those of you who are still on here, enrollment is done in about 11 days. So we're wrapping up enrollments here real quick. And we will not have a session next week, so you guys can get that information into us. So thanks a lot, y'all. Really appreciate the time on a Monday, and have a great week.
Bye.
Thank you.
We'll see you all later.